what really ails the sugar sector? That is what we're discussing on Checkpoint today, and we feel that the controversy surrounding the sugar sector has given us an opportunity to delve into these matters and have greater understanding for all stakeholders, not just in Kenya, in Uganda, but what this means also for regional integration in the East African community. My guests, Karidhi Muremi and Anzetse Were, thank you both for coming. Let's start off with what's been missing from the debate. Obviously, there's been a lot of political rhetoric, a lot of counter accusations back and forth. But Muremi, what's the big thing that we've been missing from the conversation surrounding this supposed deal on sugar importation?
In very simple terms, there are two things we are missing. The first one is that it's not a new debate. To say that COMESA has been with us from 2000 is a fact. To say that the free trade area was accepted by COMESA in 2000 is a fact. Therefore, indirectly, we have had 15 years. So one of the bigger questions is what we have been doing with 15 years. So that's one area which is missing. The other one, which is more fundamental, and this is where some of us have a lot of question marks with the MPs and all those political class, is that Wajiko in 2010 actually passed a constitution which in Article 2.5 basically says that all international agreements are part of the laws of Kenya. It went on to say in Article 2.6 that all treaties that we have so far signed will actually form part of our laws. So one of the bigger questions is that if you are a Western Kenya MP or any of those areas, why did you allow your people to vote yes? If you knew that we have indirectly constitutionalized the East African community, the COMESA, the EPAS, and all those trade negotiations that Kenya as a country had already signed. So those are the two big issues which we are missing in the whole debate. And to be honest with you, the reason why CS Amina and the others are saying that there was no agreement signed is because the issue of an agreement was domesticated by our own MPs long before the 2010 Parliament, when we domesticated what we call the East African community, when we set what we call the East African Parliament, when Kenya nominated its own MPs to join the East African Parliament, when we domesticated the East African Protocol, when in January 2005 we passed the customs union under the community. So what our president was basically asked in Uganda was, why is Kenya introducing a non-tariff barrier in a protocol already domesticated by your parliament?
Okay, all right. And we'll come back to that. But let's talk about, before we get into the sugar sector proper and some of the agreements that we have signed on to, but are yet to do our end of the deal. But Anzetse, these regional trade obligations, if anything, this whole controversy has just exposed how tricky that is, meeting those regional trade obligations versus, of course, safeguarding, the rights and, of course, also the protections of locals.
Yes.
Because that's what we're talking about now. We're saying, okay, we're part of the EAC, but what about our farmers? What about our locals? So talk to us about the intricacies of that, because that's become apparent now.
I think you have to understand that when countries get into regional agreements, there are two tensions that they have to resolve. One is leveraging economies of scale and becoming a bigger market for products, freedom and free movement of goods and people, making it easier to do business. But the other are the sort of the sovereign interest and the interests of that nation in particular. So as Kenya goes into these negotiations, those are the two tensions that they have to resolve. So this sugar issue is just sort of highlighting those two tensions. On one hand, we have a local sugar industry that we want to protect. On the other hand, we do have a good deal coming out of Uganda, possibly, that we've been taking advantage of for a long time. So I think those are always the conversations as you go in. And also you need to understand that as the dominant player in the East African region economically, sometimes we have to make concessions on certain things in order to build our soft power, to build our geopolitical control, and as well as to build, a sense of goodwill between nations. So sometimes there'll be considerations out of economics when different countries come together to make agreements. So there is always that dance that government has to do as they get into regional agreements.
All right, let's talk about how it's been handled, by both sides of the political divide in Kenya. What this also says, like we'd alluded to earlier, about our trade relations, about our regional integration. We have our viewers watching in Uganda now. What must this be doing, for this region from both sides of the political divide?
I think the problem that I've been having with this conversation is that we're not looking at how we're contributing to this problem. We've made this an issue about Uganda. And the real issue is the problems within our own sugar sector. Because if you look at the sugar issue, if I could just go into that for a bit, the reality of the matter is that Kenyan sugar is very uncompetitive. And in fact, the estimates that I have is that it takes $500 to produce a ton of sugar in Kenya. It costs $180 in Uganda. So why shouldn't we be taking that advantage? Isn't that part of the economies of scales that we are trying to get through these regional agreements? Shouldn't we be making it more affordable for Kenyans to live? And some economists are of the view that we shouldn't be complaining about cheap sugar from Uganda. This is good for consumers in Kenya, particularly for low-income consumers at the bottom of the pyramid. It makes sugar more available to them, where 20 and 30 shillings is a big deal for them. So why are we penalizing low-income consumers because of the internal problems we have around managing our sugar industry? So there are concerns that we're making this about Uganda, when really the issue is, why is Kenyan sugar uncompetitive? As you said rightly, with the commerce, we've extended and extended and extended. We're not fixing it. And then government comes in and puts in 1 billion into Mumias. People would argue that money could be used, better elsewhere. And also the other thing that sort of becomes interesting is that there's this impression that perhaps government wants to flood the market with cheap imports, but government introduced raised duty by 130% on imported sugar. So there are efforts on the part of government to try and protect the local industry from foreign competition. And of course, some people are saying, well, government shouldn't be doing that. If our sugar industry is not functioning properly, can we get that up and running so that we can compete with the likes of Uganda and produce well?
That's right. Murimi, why is our sugar industry so uncompetitive? We've had these safeguards for over a decade now. We've sought an extension. What's the problem?
The problem is we haven't accepted the problem. That's where the problem is. If you don't define your problem, then whatever solution you are coming up with, you'll fail the test. Kenyans need to know that from 1989, when the debate of structural adjustment came into Kenya, one of the crops that we deliberately as a country through politics avoided to touch was sugar. So we handled maize, we handled wheat, we handled those type of commodities, but sugar somehow has always been left hanging. The research that has been carried by different economists, World Bank included, indicate that one of the reasons that was kind of agreed is because sugar is a very easy way of funding what you call politics. So what I'm saying in short is that as long as the politician wants to have a poor person to use correctly, then the problem of sugar will never be fixed. Why on earth would somebody not be introducing horticulture in some of these areas?
Precisely.
Why would you not allow them to grow soybeans? Why do you want them to grow a crop which permanently makes them poor? What is the rationale? So to my mind, we need to almost open the truth. And if you want to understand Kenyan agricultural sector, what we basically did is immediately after independence, the so-called white farmers were using, in quote, the raw labor cost of the African. Mm-hmm. They were also using indirectly very protective policies, indirectly to become who they were. After independence, the large farms went to selected Kenyans in whichever name. Those Kenyans, unfortunately, formed the bigger part of government. So the word subsidize, the word give me this price per kilo, has always been a negotiation, not for the consumer, but for the big. We call it the problem of the colonial farmer being practiced in a political modern Kenya. Now, to come back to your answer, what we are basically dealing with is you have very small rad sizes. So to mechanize those areas becomes a question mark. You have very inefficient sugar yields, which questions the research capacity on the sugar field, which brings to a question mark on Kenya Sugar Board as an institution. Then you have a ministry in terms of agriculture, which uses the same yesterday, thinking they'll get a new today. So you have policy disconnect between what they think they are doing and the reality on the ground.
All right.
Then you have the hidden one, and the hidden one is what we are discussing. You have politics crowding the solving of the answer.
All right, and how have other countries been able to do it much better than we have? We know what's happening in Uganda, in Tanzania, in Malawi. I mean, there's several other countries in this region that are doing much better than we are. Tanzania, obviously, the issue of subdividing of land, isn't such a problem as it is in Kenya, for example. I mean, and year on year, we keep, we subsidize seed, and this is not just for sugarcane, we subsidize fertilizer. During the planting season, we've even seen in Kenya where people say, where's the seed? Where's the fertilizer? Are we going about this the right way?
I think the reason why this is also such a touchy issue is that we're dealing with the land issue, or we're not dealing with the land issue. As he rightly stated, a lot of sugarcane farmers are smallholder farmers, right? Which often, and the other issue is that they're smallholder farmers and they often don't have title for their land because the land is subdivided in the spirit of inheritance. So although they're using the land and they feel that they own it, they don't have the title that they can then go to the bank, get credit, get the inputs, and make their farms more efficient, etc. So there are a lot of people, first of all, using very inefficient and traditional farming methods, which means that they're very low yields and the sucrose content of the sugarcane isn't as high as it should be. And in fact, one of the questions that have been asked to Kenya is, why aren't you guys changing the variety of sugarcane you're planting so that you charge as to how much sucrose is in it rather than the weight of the sugarcane itself.
Right.
And these are some of the issues that we're not really getting to the bottom of as we're speaking on this issue. So I think unless we deal with the land issue, because the other issue is when you don't have title and you're a smallholder farmer, you can't conglomerate many different smallholder farms into a larger farm that can be run more efficiently. So part of the problems that we're seeing that are structural in the way land is used in Kenya is feeding into the inefficiencies of the sector. Then you add the issue of inputs such as electricity. And if you look at some of the machinery in some of our factories, they're very old, they're very aging, which makes them very inefficient.
Right.
So there is also questions of how will this money that Mumias is getting be used? What's the best method of using it? Are we going to buy a bunch of new machines? Are we going to restructure management? Are we going to get new people in there? There are all these questions around how do we best use that money, given the reality that on the ground, getting sugarcane out of the land is quite difficult and quite ineffective and inefficient.
What should we have done in all this time that we've been asking for safeguards from COMESA? We know about, restructuring the industry, improving infrastructure, privatization. Murimi, just tell us where we should have been with that and what more we need to do, because we've extended this until 2017, but surely if we haven't done this again by then, just perhaps for the average viewer watching today, what we can start to hold our government to account, if it's privatization of the firms, if it's, taking a look at that, and while we're privatizing one, here's Mumias again needing a bailout. What were we supposed to have done during this time, so that we can just start to accelerate that?
There are basically four things that we need to get right. The first is that we should not hide the reality. The reality is that COMESA is there and the East African community is there. Once you agree with that, then the next question you ask yourself is, what is the current information that you should be using to help your farmers move to what is commercially viable? And that to me is where the whole question of leadership comes in. Because in our own Vision 2030, we actually identified that we will move agriculture to commercially viable agriculture. So having agreed with that vision philosophy, you don't then have to give the word sugar, maize, wheat a personal emotional attachment. What you need to do is to remove yourself from emotion and reorganize the solution to where that land is sitting. So if you have areas like, if we become personal, we say Mumias as a zone. And I agree that the population in that area does not allow them to have lesser sizes of land. Then can I move the skill? In other words, can I move those farmers to the corridor of Ramu, where they can grow sugarcane, but now the rad mass is bigger. The government is doing a Garana 1 million irrigation, those type of questions. So that the philosophy of the constitution that you can own rad anywhere in Kenya is implemented by getting skilled sugar farmers to go and start good sugar farming in another corridor. In the meantime, those who do good beans like soya can move back to these other areas.
Okay.
So the whole chapter 5 implementation in terms of the RAD chapter is basically what I'm trying to bring to the table. Because we need to respect that Wajiko has actually spoken. These things are sitting in the constitution. Is getting the courage and the character to do the implementation. So that's one. The next one is the whole area of what we call selfish interest in terms of what is it that you are defending. The only reason Uganda is raising temperature is because you have interested political interest sitting in Mombasa, either in terms of lorry owners, either in terms of grain handling facilities. Those interests are the ones causing the noise that we are basically tending to talk about. So the second thing is we need to remove what we have always used since independence, which is going to parliament so that you become rich by putting laws and incentives which are personal to what you own. So we need to learn away from that. And that's where the word privatization technically comes in. Because are there people wanting sugar industry to go down so that the unit cost of the asset to be privatized is lower,
yes.
And therefore I buy.
Right.
And if I buy, am I buying the factory or is it the empty rad I want? Because you can transform, you just need to put your mind in Kiambu, where the so-called coffee is now housing estates. So may you be having those behind-the-scene type of machinations which people are playing around, but using you as a poor voter to think that they are on your side.
And I'd like to just interrupt for a moment, because that has come up in the discussions and the heated rhetoric that we've seen across, the better part of last week. And it's talking about this and saying sugar barons. Now it's become one side saying, but the sugar barons funded the campaign of one area. Others saying no, but it's the sugar barons. Do we know this sugar barons?
Officially, don't go around in circles. Officially, Parliament has the names. Remember, there was a parliamentary committee on sugar specifically, and specifically they went all the way to Mombasa. They actually opened a go down. Some of the MPs were even threatened. So it's not something that is not in the public domain.
So why can't we fix it? Why can't we name the barons and start?
Understanding is this. The country that you are calling Kenya, unfortunately, has educated children. So part of the new debate we are having is because the children from Western Kenya are now asking some of the fundamental questions. And the politician may not have very far places to go hiding. The Parliamentary Accounts Committee, the Parliamentary Investment Committee have enough data on which sugar company, which sugar farmers, and all those things. If you are thinking an answer to this problem, and I'm from, let's say, Mumias Farmer Growing Society, and note I'm using the word farmer. Mumias, my factory, has been put on maintenance. The best I can do is to go to the Ministry of Agriculture and say, my president says we can import sugar from Uganda. Can you give us a license to import as farmers?
Exactly.
The moment the word farmer imports that sugar, then the word baron will disappear.
Okay.
But remember, for this one to disappear, politics will suffer. And the farmer will become richer because he's now the one making the profit.
Okay, let's talk about information, that is available even to farmers. And this is something that you've mentioned, Murimi, quite a bit. We're giving subsidies on seed, on fertilizer, on that sort of thing. Are we building that capacity amongst the farmers? And also in line with information, that seems to be the one thing we can't seem to get a hang of. Do we have a deal? Do we not? What was signed, if at all? between whom? Was it government to government, that sort of thing?
I think the first issue in terms of farmers, I think you need to understand that often when we say we're subsidizing seeds or fertilizer, etc., sometimes that is not realized on the ground in terms of farmers actually getting access to that. So one of the biggest problems that smallholder farmers have is getting access to affordable inputs to make their crops efficient. So I think what needs to be done, or what has been done, and what needs to be sort of unraveled and implemented is why some of these subsidies that have been, theoretically introduced not being felt on the ground by farmers, because this is a serious issue and a serious concern for them, because it affects obviously how much money they get at the end of the day. And I think in terms of information, there is the information present, but I think what is done is, just as he's been alluding to, there's an obfuscation of the issue. There's a cloud of secrecy that goes through it, and it makes it difficult for you to go through and say, okay, where do I do this? How do I get that? And how do I do this? And I think that's why I'm saying that this is an internal Kenyan problem. Uganda should not be in this debate in any way whatsoever. We should not be talking about Uganda. Uganda is not the problem. The problem is what we're doing internally as Kenyans. And I think that's why, it's being politicized, because perhaps people are trying to, divert attention from what should really be talked about.
All right, and it's been said that this is being politicized simply because we don't have enough information on this. I think the president says we have a deal, we're going ahead with it because this is in the best interest of the country. We'd rather get sugar from Uganda than from Brazil. And then we have the cabinet secretaries saying, well, technically no deal was signed. Do you think if we actually knew what happened in Uganda, that this debate would be...
It wouldn't be, because we have a sugar deficit of 210,000 tons. Like, we don't have enough sugar in this country, so we need to import it, So if the issue is that we're importing sugar, well, yes, because we're not producing enough sugar in the first place.
Right.
So I don't think really the issue is whether sugar is coming in. I think it's the vested interests, and the sort of the seditious nature of the interests of people within the sugar industry that are making people divert attention from the fact that we have an inefficient sector, we are not producing enough sugar, our sugar is uncompetitive, our factories are not working properly and mismanaged, we're using aged equipment, we have very expensive electricity, and all of these factors come together to make sugar a very expensive product for Kenyans to consume. So the question is, even if we were to import all of Uganda's surplus, that wouldn't feed our deficit.
It still wouldn't.
That's the reality, So we do need to import sugar. So I think people need to stop sort of looking at this as a Uganda issue, and sort of look at it as, this is a sugar deficit we have, these are the problems in the sugar industry, how do we resolve them without politicizing everything?
Marimi, it's not just about sugar. There's maize as well, and once we start with the SGR, and once that gets into Uganda, surely something will be leaving on that cargo train into Uganda, and from Uganda back into Kenya. Maize is also another hot button issue, isn't it?
In fact, let's put the facts on the table. What basically happened in Uganda is not a secret. We had both Kenyans and Ugandan business people. The first round of the meeting, which happened in Serena Hotel in Kampala, was the equivalent of what we call a KEPSA round table with the ministers of the two countries. It is in that discussion that the Ugandans raised the sugar, and our minister, who is Amina,
responded,
said we will look at it.
Right.
Not we have this agreement, but we'll look at it. When that was raised, Kenyans then raised the issue of chicken. Okay, the chicken has been a major issue. Like from the Kenchicks, the Mogokos, we have serious farmers in Bugoma who produce excess chicken and they can't take it to Uganda. So that's the one we are calling meat, but it's basically the chicken area which was raised. So the day two, the two presidents then received what indirectly was the summary of the private sector discussion. So coming back to the table, maize has been raised by Uganda. They have asked, why is our maize not being allowed to enter Kenya? On the account, currently we are using the word moisture. For sugar, we stopped the sugar from Uganda in 2011 through KRA. What Uganda has done, when KRA invoked the banning, they used the COMESA regulation. They said COMESA gives Kenya a quota, and that quota has been exhausted, so we can't allow you to come in. So the Uganda minister then invoked what we call the East African Community Protocol. They said we are going to report Kenya to WTO for bringing in an untariff barrier. Now, once you hear WTO, that's a world issue.
Yeah.
And therefore it starts bringing a different angle altogether. For the president, he's managing the total export as a volume. So he's not looking at whether it's sugar or tea.
Yeah.
He's saying my volume of exports is
Right.
going down, my imports are going up,
Yeah.
my currency is going. So that's what the president is managing in total. So when we come to the detail for this country are basically one. For how long do you continue indirectly managing what seems not to be profitable? And for how long will you have poverty as a leader to a point of wanting your people to continue in poverty? Because it's not a question of producing sugar or producing maize or producing wheat. It's a question on, are our farmers having information to do the profitable farming they should do?
Absolutely.
And to me, that's where the word policy comes in.
Uh-huh.
How do you remove the yesterday interest of those who own large tracts of land who have been using government to give subsidies for their own personal benefit?
Okay.
Because unless you unlock that, this animal we call 50% poor Kenyans will never disappear.
Absolutely. And I'd like you to hold that thought because we want to take a short break right now on Checkpoint. We'll be right back and we will start focusing on trade within the region and the tariff barriers and the non-tariff barriers that exist, because remember, this again is an East African discussion. We'll be back with Checkpoint in a few moments.